Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today, in honor of the holidays, we're going to be doing a video on philosophy of religion. We're going to be doing Gödel's ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, Gödel is most commonly identified with his work in mathematical logic, particularly his famous incompleteness theorems. However, he also outlined an ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the other ontological arguments for the existence of God that we've covered, which is one of the reasons I haven't done it in the past, but we got a lot of requests, and someone decided to donate $10 a month to request this video specifically, so we're going to do a video on it. This argument was not published until after his death, but it's attracted some attention due to Gödel's logical and mathematical prowess. In this video, we're just going to look at the axioms and the definitions which go into Gödel's argument. Basically, the things that you would have to accept in order to get the argument going. We're going to save the underlying logic, because it's a little bit complicated, for a future video. Though, don't worry, we're definitely going to get there, because this is a cool argument, both in what it does, but also in the way that it works logically. And in fact, it's probably more interesting logically than it is as an argument for the existence of God. In the next video following this one, we'll take a look at some of the objections to these axioms and definitions. So, Gödel's argument can be outlined as being comprised of 3 definitions and 6 axioms, which are used to prove theorems and eventually a proof that God exists, or that the property of being godlike is exemplified. His definitions are of essential property, godlike, and necessary existence. These definitions, in combination with 6 axioms, prove that there is something which is godlike. In these axioms, Gödel relies heavily on an intuitive notion of a positive property, though he does not define it. If you accept his definitions and axioms, the argument goes that you must also accept that God exists. So let's take a look. His second definition is the toughest piece of this argument, so we're going to look at it first. I can't promise I can give you a perfect explanation of it, because it's a little hard to wrap your head around, but we'll do our best. Some property P is essential to a subject S, if and only if, for all properties Q, S has Q necessarily is materially equivalent to P implies Q. Basically, an essential property for something is something which implies all of the necessary properties about that object. So in other words, saying that some subject S has some property Q in all possible worlds is equivalent to saying that any essential property of S implies Q. Or to put it another way, if and only if S having Q necessarily is equivalent to P implying Q, then P is essential to S. Or any property of S which entails all and only necessary properties of S is essential to S. Now, this definition alone is not going to really be problematic or contested, because most people don't have kind of an intuitive notion of essential property that this could map onto. Maybe you have an intuitive notion of what an essential property is, and this logical definition doesn't perfectly match onto that idea, at which point you might be concerned about it. But if you don't have that intuitive notion, this probably isn't going to be the place you're going to be concerned with the argument. Now, something that's frequently stated as definition 1, saying some subject S is godlike is materially equivalent to saying that the essential properties of S are the set of all positive properties. And here's where we introduce that concept of positive property, which is going to be a little confusing. So, this may seem like a traditional definition of God. Basically, God is all and only that which is good and positive. Whether you're concerned about this definition of godlike will probably hinge on your basic understanding of what a positive property is. This is also to say that the only thing this argument is going to do is prove that there is something which is godlike. And so it is a very easy place to object to this argument, to say, we'll take everything you have, but something that is godlike is not any of the gods that people worship today. And so you could call something that doesn't look godlike as godlike. But that's not the goal of the argument. The goal of the argument is not to prove the Christian God or something like that. It's to prove that there exists something which is godlike, and we're going to define godlike as something which possesses all positive properties, which sounds a lot like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. And some S necessarily exists if and only if all of the essential properties of S are exemplified in all possible worlds. So this definition might give you pause, since the essential properties of S don't need to be exemplified by S in all possible worlds to cause necessary existence to be implied, simply by some subject. However, since essences necessarily imply the other necessary properties of S, if those essences are necessarily exemplified in all possible worlds, then those other properties are going to be exemplified by that subject as well. This is a confusing piece of it, but is not going to be the place where most people who are objecting to this argument are going to have real concerns. We'll look at some objections in the next video to even this, but the deeper concerns are going to lie in the axioms more than the definitions. Axiom 1. If a property is positive, then its negation is not positive. Note, we are not defining positive property. We're just going to give axioms that tell you kind of what it means. This seems generally intuitive. If it's positive to have a certain thing, then not having that thing would not be positive. That seems like an intuitive idea around positive. And it seems like our basic notions that we might have if you offered some definition of positive in your own mind, this would map onto it well. Axiom 2. If in all possible worlds some property P implies another property Q, if P is positive, then Q is positive. Well, once again, intuitively, if something is positive, then those things which necessarily follow from it, not just happen to follow from it, but necessarily follow from it in all possible worlds, must also be positive. That, once again, seems intuitive with our basic notion of positive. Being godlike is a positive property. Most people would probably claim that being God is a good thing, that it's a positive thing to be God. And because our specific definition of godlike has to do with just having all of the positive properties, it would seem that having all properties which are positive is itself a positive property. Axiom 4. If some property is positive, then it is positive in all possible worlds. Basically, if something is good, then it is necessarily good. Or if something is positive, it's necessarily positive. It's positive no matter what possible world you are in. If we think about some of the features of God, you can see an argument for, well, being omnipotent no matter what possible world you're in. It's better to be omnipotent than not. Existing in all possible worlds is positive. The argument here might go something like, it's better to exist in more possible worlds than fewer. It's really bad not to exist in any possible world, so the more you can exist in, the better. And therefore, existing in all possible worlds would be the most positive, and that would be the positive property. And finally, in terms of axioms, for all properties, if having that property is positive, then it is also positive to have that property in all possible worlds. This is very similar to Axiom 4. It's slightly different. Axiom 4 is saying that the properties themselves are positive. If they're positive in one world, they're positive in all possible worlds. This is saying that if having a property is positive, then having that property is positive in all possible worlds. If having something is positive here, then it's just as positive to have it somewhere else. If you accept these axioms and definitions, along with axioms K and B of modal logic, you are logically committed to the conclusion that being godlike is exemplified in all possible worlds. We'll go through the logic of this in another video, maybe after we've built up some of the work that you need in higher order logic to get there. But for now, here are the theorems which lead to that conclusion. All positive properties are exemplified in some possible world. Being godlike is exemplified in some possible worlds. If that's a positive property, it follows. Being godlike is an essential property to anything which is godlike. And the property of being godlike is exemplified in all possible worlds. These are just going to directly follow from our definitions of godlike essential properties and what it is to necessarily exist. And if the property of being godlike is exemplified in all possible worlds, God exists in all possible worlds. As great a logician as Godel was, and despite his argument avoiding some of the pitfalls of other ontological arguments, I'm ultimately unconvinced. In the next video, we're going to outline 8 objections for the 8 nights of Hanukkah, let's call it, to the axioms and definitions of this argument. Thanks to Mohammed Benabakar for supporting this video with his generous donation of $10 a month on Patreon. If you too want to recommend a topic for a video, donate at least $10 a month on Patreon. Usually I'll just do a dumbfounding definitions, dizzying distinctions, and diabolical doctrines video on the topic, but if it's something that enough people have asked me about and doesn't quite fit in that category, you might see a longer video, like this one and the following video, which are both going to cover this topic. Have a good holiday. Stay tuned for video 700 and the giveaway coming January 14th, 2018. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.